The island of Borneo is a land of primeval jungle. The coasts are fringed with mangrove and swamp, and over 9/10 of the interior is covered with thick evergreen forests. In 1941 the population was small, that of the whole island was estimated at less than 3 million, and there were less than a dozen settlements large enough to be called towns. There were few roads and only one short railway. Communication was by the many waterways or by narrow jungle paths. Much of the interior was unexplored or very inadequately known. It was rich in oil and other raw materials. The island was partly Dutch and partly British. British Borneo lay along its northern seaboard and comprised the two states of British North Borneo and Sarawak, the small protected state of Brunei, and the crown colony of Labuan Island. North Borneo and Sarawak were not technically British colonies, but protectorates, all of whom depended upon the British for their protection and to run their foreign affairs. British North Borneo was administered by a chartered company of the same name. Labuan, just offshore, was administered directly by the British from Singapore. Brunei was a sultanate, and therefore an autonomous entity, although it was under British protection, and the resident British administrator wielded more practical administrative power than the Sultan. Sarawak, meanwhile, was a kingdom ruled since 1841 by the British-born Brooke family, who were called the White Rajas. Looking for protection from pirates and other regional powers, the Brookes were interested in a protectorate relationship with Britain, but the British were content to simply recognize them as an independent country. Oil and its importance had yet to be discovered, and the British were not interested. Later, in 1888, the United Kingdom finally granted protectorate status. While the rest of the island, collectively known as Kalimantan, was under Dutch control since 1824. Of the 5 major islands on the Dutch East Indies, Borneo was the primary objective for Japanese because of the great oil fields that were located in both the British north and on the Dutch west side. Borneo occupies a position of great strategic importance in the Southwest Pacific. It lies across the main sea routes from the north to Malaya and Sumatra on the one hand, and Celebes and Java on the other. Strongly held, it could have been one of the main bastions in the defense of the Malay barrier, but neither the Dutch nor the British had the necessary resources to defend it. The available forces had to be concentrated further south for the defense of Singapore and Java, and all that could be spared for Borneo, and the outlying Dutch islands were small detachments at important points which it was hoped might prove a deterrent to attack. The oil fields in British Borneo lay in 2 groups, one at Miri close to the northern boundary of Sarawak, and the other at Syria, in the state of Brunei. The crude oil was pumped from both fields to a refinery at Lutong, on the coast, from which loading lines ran out to sea. For defense at northern Borneo, Commander-in-Chief Far East, Sir Robert Brooke Popham, had ordered the 2nd Battalion of 15th Punjab Regiment, a heavy 6-inch gun battery from the Hong Kong-Singapore Royal Artillery, and a detachment of 35th Royal Engineer Fortress Company to proceed to Kuching, unsupported by air or naval assets. Given the area's importance as an oil producer, he should have done more. The only place which it was decided to hold was Kuching, the reason for this being not only that there was a modern airfield at this location, but that its occupation by the enemy might give access to the Dutch airfields in Borneo. Furthermore, it would also give the enemy access to Singapore. There had been a small RAF contingent at Kuching, but this had been pulled back to Singapore several months earlier. Brooke Popham's orders in case of a Japanese attack were simply to burn, not defend, the petroleum industry infrastructure. In December 1940, a company of 215th Punjab was sent to Miri for the protection of the demolition parties. These troops were entrusted with the destruction of Miri oil fields. While at Kuching was deployed a force of 6 platoons of infantry from 215th Punjab Regiment. These troops were to conduct the delaying action at the Bigitstabar airfield outside of Kuching. While that White Raja assembled a small army of local tribesmen into a unit which he called the Sarawak Rangers. This force consisted of 1,515 troops, who were primarily Eben and Dayak tribesmen trained in the art of jungle warfare. The defenders, Punjabis as well as Rangers, were under the unified command of Lieutenant Colonel C.M. Lane as the Sarawak Force, SAFOR. In August 1941, it was also decided that no attempt should be made to defend British North Borneo, Brunei or Labuan, and the Governor of North Borneo, Mr. Robert Smith, was informed that the volunteers and police were to be used solely for the maintenance of internal security. The oil fields in Dutch Borneo lies on the east coast of Dutch Borneo, including both drilling and refining, was centered at 2 locations. First was Tarakan Island, and second was Balikpapan. The defenses in place to fend off Japanese attacks were inadequate at East Borneo Island. As with the British in northern Borneo Island, the Dutch had left the east side of the island only lightly defended, planning to deny their petroleum resources to the Japanese. The Royal Netherlands East Indies Army, KNIL, maintained its 6th Infantry Battalion at Balikpapan numbered approximately 1,100 men, and its 7th Infantry Battalion at Tarakan numbered approximately 1,300 men. These units were each supported by 2 field artillery batteries, and the ports were defended by coastal artillery batteries, each of which consisted of a pair of 120mm guns and 4 75mm guns. The Dutch commanders at the 2 locations were Lieutenant Colonel Cornelius van den Hoorgenband at Balikpapan and Lieutenant Colonel Simon de Waal at Tarakan. Banjarmasin, the Dutch administrative capital for its part of Borneo, was effectively undefended. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Halkema commanded a contingent of about 500 troops and no artillery. Like Tarakan and Balikpapan, Banjarmasin was also a center of petroleum activities, but of less significance than the other 2. Overhead, the mainstay of the military aviation of the Royal Netherlands East Indies MLKNIL, was equipped with American-built aircraft, such as Glen Martin bombers, as well as Curtiss Hawk, and the Brewster Buffalo, the type that had proven so inadequate in Malaya. While the Royal Netherlands Navy provided the submarines of its divisie on the Sea Bottom 3, and a small number of support vessels. In the West Borneo Island, the Dutch forces had a secret airfield near the border of British Borneo called Singkawang 2, which was defended by a small Dutch garrison. On the 25th of November, 5 Brewster 3-39 Buffalo fighter planes arrived for local defense, followed at the beginning of December by Martin B-10 bombers. While in Pontianak was defended by West Borneo KNIL Garrison Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Dominicus Mars, numbering approximately 500 men. To gain control of the oil fields, to guard the flank of their advance on Malaya, and to facilitate their eventual attack on Sumatra and Western Java, the Japanese decided as a subsidiary operation to their Malayan campaign to seize British Borneo. This operation was launched by Southern Army 8 days after the initial attack on Malaya. On the 20th of November 1941, The Kawaguchi Brigade was activated in Tokyo and placed under the direct command of the Southern Army. It was commanded by Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, and it was composed mainly of the 35th Infantry Brigade and the 124th Infantry Regiment from IJA 18th Division, and reinforced by engineer units from the division and oil drilling unit. Also involved in the British Borneo operations was IJN 2nd Yokosuka Naval Landing Force. Japanese intelligence reported that the entire island was covered with dense jungle. There were no roads connecting the major cities. All long-distance transportation was by sea. For the invader, there was no opportunity to use tanks, motor vehicles, or that stellar conveyance of the Malay campaign, bicycles. Each of the objectives would require a separate amphibious assault. General Kawaguchi decided that the first landings would be made at Miri in Syria, in order to capture vital oil fields and airfields in these towns on the 16th of December 1941. Part of the force would remain in this area to re-establish Miri oil field, while the main body would advance and capture the Kuching airfield. For the East Borneo, the Japanese battle plan called for Tarakan Island to be invaded on January the 10th, with Balikpapan assaulted soon after. In preparation, the Japanese flew a number of reconnaissance missions and had begun flying bombing missions on Christmas Day. The main objective of the invasion of Tarakan Island was the capture of the oil fields, oil refineries, and the airfield located on the island. The invasion will go through the Central Force, commanded by Vice Admiral Ibo Takahashi. Leading the attack would be the 56th Mixed Infantry Group, also known as Seikoguchi Detachment, drawn from the IJA 56th Infantry Group of the 56th Division, commanded by Major General Shizuo Seikoguchi, based on the 146th Infantry Regiment, and reinforced by artillery, armored, and engineer units drawn from the division. Whereas the northern Borneo attack had launched from Cam Ranh Bay in Vietnam, the Seikoguchi detachment sailed from Davao in the Philippines, which they had captured in December, as a base of operations for the Dutch Borneo assault. Also involved in the Dutch Borneo operations was the 2nd Kuri Special Naval Landing Force, a battalion-sized contingent of IJN ground troops, under Lieutenant Commander Masonary Siga. At 1300 hours on the 13th of December 1941, the Japanese invasion convoy consisted of 10 transport ships, left Cam Ranh Bay, Indochina, escorted by an IJN under the command of Rear Admiral Shintaro Hashimoto, a task force which included the cruiser Ura, 4 destroyers, and a subjacer. It was an imposing force, considering that northern Borneo was virtually undefended. The convoy crossed the South China Sea without being sighted, and at about 23:30 on the 15th of December, the main body of the convoy arrived at the Miri in Syria anchorage. At dawn on the 16th of December 1941, 2 landing units secured Miri in Syria, with only very little resistance. The main body of the Kawaguchi detachment found only about 50 members of the police unit defending Miri. They surrendered with very little fighting. 2 companies of the 2nd Yokosuka Special Naval Landing Force landed on the coast near Lutong, and within 2.5 hours, captured the important Lutong oil refinery. Anticipating Brookpotham order to destroy the drilling and refining facilities, Kawaguchi had arrived prepared. He brought with him 4 field well drilling companies of the oil drilling section of the Kwantung Army's 21st Field Ordnance Depot. The petroleum infrastructure was torched on the 8th of December, at the first notice of the Japanese attacks from Malaya to Pearl Harbor, but the Japanese engineers were capable of repairing and restoring the drilling and refining equipment that had been damaged. After the 17th of December, The 3 battalion from main body of the detachment prepared for the next operation, the landing at Kuching. The Japanese troops suffered only 40 casualties between 16 and the 23rd of December. Most were drownings as a result of Japanese amphibious operations. Overhead, the only air support for the defenders would come from the Dutch, operating out of bases far to the south in Dutch Borneo. The first came 3 days after the invasion, on the 19th of December 2 Dutch Dornier Do-24 flying boats from Tarakan Island sank the Japanese destroyer, Shinonome, and damaged a transport ship. On the 22nd of December, having achieved their immediate objectives, the Japanese resumed their offensive. The main body, consisted of 2 battalions of the Japanese invasion force re-embarked at Murray and left for Kuching, leaving 1 battalion to secure all British Borneo outside of Sarawak. The convoy was escorted by the cruiser Ira and the 3 destroyers. The convoy was sighted and reported to Air Headquarters of Far East by Dutch reconnaissance aircraft on the morning of the 23rd. At 11:40 that morning, 24 Japanese aircraft bombed Singkawang 2 airfield, so damaging the runways that a Dutch striking force which had been ordered to attack the convoy was unable to take off with the bomb load. Commander of Air Headquarters of Far East ordered a transfer of the aircraft to Palembang on the afternoon of 24th. The Japanese convoy did not, however, escape unscathed. On the evening of the 23rd of December, it was first attacked by Dutch submarine, K-14, sank 2 Japanese ships, and damaged 2 others, and the following night, another Dutch submarine, K-16 torpedoed the IJN destroyer, Sagiri, near Kuching. The K-16 was herself sunk by Japanese submarine, I-66, on her way back to Surabaya. The convoy was seen at 1800 hours on the 23rd, approaching the mouth of the Santurpong River. 2 hours later, Colonel Lane received orders from Singapore to destroy the airfield. But it was too late to change back to mobile defense, and as there seemed to him no point in attempting to defend a useless airfield, he asked General Percival for permission to withdraw as soon as possible into Dutch northwest Borneo. While awaiting a reply, Lane concentrated his battalion at the airfield with 18-pounder gun and 3-inch mortar detachments, covering the river approaches, and a Punjabi gunboat platoon, working with the Sarawak Rangers. The Japanese troops commanded by Colonel Akino Sakoka landed at 11 o'clock on the 24th of December. Although 2nd Battalion, 15th Punjab Regiment, resisted the attack, they were soon outnumbered and retreated to nearby airfield. By the afternoon, Kuching town was in Japanese hands. The Japanese followed up and before dark made contact with the airfield defenses. As Christmas Day dawned, firing temporarily ceased. A general withdrawal into Dutch Borneo was ordered to start at dusk, but heavy firing was heard to the north of Batu Kitang shortly after noon, and fearing that his line of retreat would be cut, Colonel Lane decided on immediate withdrawal. Aware of the colonel's intention, the Japanese, reinforced by the 2nd Yokosuka Special Naval Landing Force, launched a full-scale attack. 2 of the Punjabi companies were destroyed, but the Surfer succeeded in retreating to Dutch border. At about 16:40 on the 25th, the Japanese troops completely secured the Kuching airfield. The Japanese losses during this operation were about 100 killed and 100 wounded. Following the capture of Kuching airfield, the detachment commander ordered Colonel Oka to secure the strategic area around Kuching, with the main force of the 124th Infantry Regiment, while he with 1 infantry battalion left Kuching on the 27th and returned back to Miri. On the same day, the Japanese troops captured the Temblan Island, which was the first Dutch territorial loss in the Pacific War. The retreating British later arrived at Singkawang 2 airfield on the 29th of December. The SAR was disbanded 2 days earlier, after the Sarawak State Force were released, in view of their agreement to serve only in Sarawak. At Singkawang, the British force joined with a garrison of 750 Dutch troops. Colonel Lane placed his battalion under Dutch command for the defense of the airfield and the surrounding area. The Japanese planned to attack the airfield from the north, and also from the west by a force landed on the coast. This attack was held up by bad weather for nearly a week, but on the 24th of January, 5 companies advanced along the road from the Dutch border, and by the 25th had reached a village 2.5 miles northeast of the airfield. The defenders launched an attack on the 26th, which was repulsed by Japanese. That evening, a counter-attack succeeded in turning their flank, and early on the 27th the order was given to evacuate the airfield. The remnant of British and Dutch troops retreated to Ladue, 15 miles to the southwest. Meanwhile, 3 Japanese companies had left Kuching in small craft during the night of the 25th, and by daybreak on the 27th had landed at Mangkat, due west of the airfield. Striking northeast and south, and meeting with little opposition, they quickly captured the coastal villages and moved towards Bengkajan, thus threatening to surround the Allied force at Ladue. The British and Dutch troops then retreated further into the jungle southward, trying to reach Sampit and Pangkalan Bun, where a Dutch airfield at Kautoa Ringin was located. 2 days later, on the 29th of January, the Japanese landed and seized Pontianak. On returning back to Miri on the 28th of December, Major General Kawaguchi ordered Lieutenant Colonel Watanabe to advance on the 31st by landing barges to Brunei with 1 infantry battalion. On the 1st of January 1942, 2 infantry platoons, commanded by a company commander, landed on the Bowen Island and captured the undefended island. On the 8th of January, Kawaguchi proceeded to Jesselton, and having occupied the town and Beaufort, where he disarmed the small police unit. Using 10 small fishing boats, 2 infantry companies, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Watanabe, captured Sandakan, the seat of government of British North Borneo. On the morning of the 19th of January, the Governor Robert Smith surrendered the state, and refusing to carry on the administration under Japanese control. This unit then captured Tawa and Lahadachu on the 24th and 31st respectively. The Japanese forces suffered no combat casualties during these operations. The 16 transport vessels carrying the IJA Seikoguchi detachment and the Special Naval Landing Force depart from Mindanao for attack on Tarakan Island on the 7th of January 1942. The convoy were escorted by the IJN Kruznica, 11 destroyers, 3 patrol ships, 2 seaplane tenders, and a bevy of minesweepers and patrol boats under the command of Rear Admiral Shoji Nishimura. On the 10th of January, a Dutch Dornier Do-24K flying boat spotted a Japanese invasion fleet. The Dutch commander then ordered the destruction of all oil fields on the island. At sunset on the 10th of January 1942, the convoy reached its first anchorage. In the afternoon, Tarakan Island was visible due to the smoke caused by the Dutch destruction of the oil fields and other vital installations. By night, the flames were so bright that the island was clearly visible in the dark. At 1800 hours on the 10th of January, the right wing and left wing unit boarded landing craft and started for their landing points. The assault went forward that night as planned, with the right wing and left wing unit using the fires to navigate through the smoke and darkness. The right wing unit, commanded by Colonel Kyohei Yamamoto, hit the shores on the east coast of Tarakan Island, exactly at midnight of the 11th of January, albeit not at their assigned location. followed by 2nd Kuri Special Naval Landing Force 30 minutes later. Tarakan is a large island, comprising 177 square miles, much of it jungle or marshland. The swampy terrain, combined with the smoke and fires, was a recipe for confusion. The attackers encountered pockets of resistance from KNIL troops, mainly ethnic Indonesians, and were compelled to beat off one determined counterattack. Nevertheless, with their superior numbers and superior firepower, Yamamoto troops were able to battle their way through to the vicinity of the main oil field by noon on the 11th of January. The IJN landing forces, meanwhile, ran into tough going in the jungle and did not occupy the Tarakan airfield until the following morning. Realizing that his position was untenable, and knowing that his command had essentially been sacrificed to delay the Japanese, Lieutenant Colonel Dewal conveyed an offer to surrender. Yamamoto accepted and advised General Sakaguchi. However, because of the general confusion that then prevailed, and lack of adequate communications, not all of the KNIL forces got the message. The left-wing unit of the IJ 146th Infantry landed on Tarakan at 3 o'clock of the 11th of January. Their objective was to capture the coastal artillery battery, which was manned by troops who were not yet aware of their commander's surrender. While they were making their way through deep jungle to reach the guns, which dominated the entrance to the harbor at Tarakan City, it was to turn out that IJN also not getting the message. 2 minesweepers made for the waters of Tarakan City, entered within range of the coastal guns, came under fire and were sunk. There was much rejoicing in the gun batteries, but deep embarrassment for Dewal, who had already surrendered. He agreed to obtain a surrender of the battery to avoid further bloodshed, but when the artillerymen came down to give themselves up, the Japanese tied them up and threw them into the bay. It is estimated by the Allies that 290 men were drowned. On the same day, the Empire of Japan declared war on the Kingdom of the Netherlands. General Shizuo Sakaguchi came ashore on Tarakan at midday on January the 12th, to supervise the mopping up operations and to accept Dewal's formal surrender. He remained for 48 hours before embarking with most of his detachment for the next objective, Balikpapan. On the 22nd of January, the Japanese fleet was sighted moving south by an American PBY flying boat, and in the afternoon of the 23rd of January, 9 Dutch Martin B-10 bombers, escorted by 20 Brewster Buffaloes, attacked the Japanese convoy. The transport ship, Tatsugami Miru, was damaged, and Nanameru sunk. Near Balikpapan, the Dutch submarine HNLMS K-18, under Lieutenant Commander Van Welgro in Evelt, attacked and sank the transport Saruga Meru, but was later heavily damaged itself by depth charges and forced to withdraw to Surabaya. Despite this, the Japanese unit successfully landed southeast of Balikpapan airfield on the evening of the 24th of January. The assault unit landed without meeting enemy resistance and, by dawn, had occupied the airfield. The southward advance moved slowly as the bridges had been destroyed, and the unit reached the northern outskirts of Balikpapan city on the night of the 25th of January. The Dutch garrison troops had been withdrawn, and the Japanese entered the city without a fight. A portion of the Sakaguchi detachment called the Surprise Attack Unit proceeded up the river in camouflaged landing craft, evaded detection, and landed just south of the reservoir at 4:30 on the 25th, thus cutting off the Dutch line of retreat. While the unit was advancing along the road to Balikpapan city, it ran into a Dutch military column, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel C. van den Hoegenbaan, attempting to escape from Balikpapan. After defeating this Dutch column, the Surprise Attack Unit proceeded to Balikpapan city. After Balikpapan was occupied, a new detachment was formed led by Lieutenant Colonel Kumi. He was ordered to secure and protect the oil fields. while the Japanese invasion force was landing at Balikpapan on the early morning of the 24th of January. At around 2:45 hours, the 59th U.S. Navy Destroyer Division, under Rear Admiral William A. Glassford, attacked the Japanese Navy escort. The U.S. Destroyer Division, composed of 4 Clemson-class destroyer, along with 2 cruisers, attacked the 12 transport ships and the 3 patrol ships escorting them. The Japanese destroyer escorts, meanwhile, were undertaking a search for the Dutch submarine which had been sighted earlier. With the Japanese destroyers on their submarine chase, the transports were protected mainly by the 3 patrol ships. At least 4 transport ships, Kuritakei Meru, Nanameru, Samanameru, and Tatsukami Meru, were sunk in torpedo attacks, and a patrol boat also was sunk in the attacks. 2 other transports were damaged by gunfire or torpedoes. With no effective counter-fire, the 4 USN destroyers escaped with minimal damage at 4 o'clock. Although 4 of transport ships were sunk and damaged 2 other, the USN success does not impact the Japanese, because the invasion troops already disembarked from the transport. For General Shizuo Sakaguchi, the conquest of Balikpapan on January the 26th left only Banjarmasin at the south end of Borneo, which was important because it was the seat of Dutch power, and the only major population center on Borneo that was not yet under Japanese control. The area around Banjarmasin was strategically important to the Japanese because of the well-constructed airfields, which would be important bases for Japanese bombers, patrolling and controlling the waterways to the south, as operations were undertaken across the rest of the Dutch East Indies. For this next step, Japanese tactics changed significantly, largely because Japanese naval power was being assembled for operations in Java and Sumatra, and because the Sakaguchi detachment had lost most of its transport ships to enemy action. The next step would not be an amphibious operation. Rather, it would be a pincer movement that depended mainly on an overland march across the southern tip of Borneo. Rather than embarking most of his entire force, Sakaguchi just sent 1 battalion to advance through the mountainous jungle terrain and then steadily south towards to Banjarmasin. This force were named the Land Drive Unit. On January the 27th, the Sea Drive Unit consisted of 1 infantry company under Captain Yoshibumi Okamoto, left Balikpapan aboard small boats, intending to follow the coastline all the way to Banjarmasin and join the Land Drive Unit. His group headquarters would not take part and would remain in Balikpapan to assume operational command. The forces were to coordinate surprise attacks on Banjarmasin and capture the town. The Land Drive Unit under command of Colonel Kahei Yamamoto left Balikpapan on the evening of the 30th of January and landed in Adang Bay without opposition before daybreak on the 31st of January. They marched due west carrying 9 days' worth of field rations and bicycles, which proved useless on the jungle trails. The mountainous terrain proved to be a far greater obstacle than the handful of KNIL troops which they encountered, and many of the Japanese soldiers came down with malaria or other tropical diseases. By the 8th of February, the Sea Drive Unit, who moved only at night to conceal its position, had come ashore south of Banjarmasin and advanced overland without opposition to the airfield. Colonel Halkima, meanwhile, had abandoned the city with his last 75 troops and had retreated into central Borneo, where he was ordered to defend the airfield at Gautuaringin. At 9 o'clock on the 10th of February, the Martapura airfield was captured by the advance force. By the evening of the 10th of February, with the arrival of the main force and the Sea Land Unit, Banjarmasin was finally occupied. There was no fighting.
tennoeiga banzai!
Most of the Dutch and British troops, after the battle, retreated further into the terrible jungle of central Borneo Island. Most of these troops were captured by the Japanese. There were, however, small parties that went to fight on in the jungle, but they were all overwhelmed and usually executed by the Japanese. The Japanese also paid the Dayaks, native people who were extremely violent towards the Dutch, to search for soldiers and to kill them. The Dutch also lost most of the native soldiers due to desertion. After 10 weeks in the jungle-covered mountains, Allied troops surrendered on the 1st of April 1942. The IJA, which had soundly defeated a superior British force in Malaya, had now secured Dutch Borneo in the space of just 30 days without a significant land battle. With the latter victory, counterintuitively underreported in the global media of 1942, and largely overlooked in the history books, Japan had secured the petroleum that would fuel its triumphant war machine indefinitely. It takes Japanese 56 days to conquer the Borneo Island. Throughout the campaign, total Allied casualties amounted to 2,599 killed or wounded, and 871 captured, while Japanese losses during this period amounted to 872 battle casualties, and 9 due to malaria and tropical diseases. The Japanese subsequently renamed the northern part as Borneo, Labuan as Madashima, and the neighboring Dutch territories as Borneo. For the first time in modern history, all of Borneo was under a single rule of the Empire of Japan. With Borneo now secured, the Japanese now planned in advance that placed Java and its capital Batavia, the richest center of the Dutch Empire, as the prime target of its southward advance. Thank you for watching. Please stay tuned on the channel for the future video, press like, leave comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more videos.